Welcome to Miss Marple Mystery. A quiet village, a cup of tea, and a sip that was never meant for him. Where are you listening from tonight? Let us know below. It was one of those perfect June afternoons when Mary Mead seemed to bask in an almost exaggerated sense of peace. The sun dripped like honey across the churchyard stones, the hum of bees rose lazily from the vicarage garden, and even the chatter of the Women's Institute felt softened by the warmth. At the Bluebell Tea Rooms, Mrs. Bellingham, proprietress, gossip collector, and unchallenged queen of village hospitality, was hosting her annual charity tea for the church roof fund. Every table was filled with lace doilies, gleaming teacups, and the comforting scent of scones, jam, and lavender polish. Miss Jane Marple, sitting quietly near the window, stirred her tea with gentle precision. She was listening, as she always did, with apparent absent-mindedness but the sharpness of a cat in sunlight. Across from her sat Mrs. Clement, wife of the vicar, who was recounting with prim delight the recent arrival of a new lodger at Ivy Cottage. An artist, or so he claimed, though his accent was oddly unplaceable, and his rent paid in cash. An artist, you say? Miss Marple murmured, her eyes fixed thoughtfully on the pattern of her spoon. I always think it curious how artistic temperaments seem to draw out both admiration and alarm in equal measure. Before Mrs. Clement could reply, the doorbell tinkled brightly. In came Mr. Alfred Longman, chairman of the parish council. Large, florid, and known to enjoy being the center of every table he joined, he greeted the room with his usual pomp, demanded his usual cup of strong Darjeeling, and settled at the table beside Miss Marple's with Mrs. Bellingham fluttering at his elbow. It was all very ordinary, until the scream came. A high, thin cry that silenced even the tea urn. Every head turned toward the corner table, where Mrs. Hartnell, the grocer's wife, sat frozen, her cup overturned, brown liquid spreading like a dark flower across the cloth. Mr. Longman had slumped forward, his large hand still clutching a half-eaten scone. For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. Then, as the chair toppled backward and his teacup shattered, chaos erupted. Women gasped. Mrs. Bellingham sobbed into her apron, and someone shouted for the doctor. Miss Marple rose slowly, her face calm, her eyes already moving not toward the body, but toward the untouched teacups and the neatly written name tags placed for each guest. The doctor arrived from the green within minutes, his bicycle clattering against the curb. He bent over Mr. Longman, checked his pulse, and with a grave shake of the head, pronounced him gone. Heart failure, most likely, he said uncertainly. He's had trouble before. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered on a single cup, the one Mr. Longman had taken, though his name card was placed at the next seat. That cup, she noted quietly, had originally belonged to Mrs. Clement, and as the village buzzed in panic and speculation, she folded her hands neatly before her and thought, with grim clarity, someone here poured a cup of death meant for someone else. She said nothing, of course not yet. She merely asked Mrs. Bellingham for a fresh pot of tea. The Bluebell Tea Rooms emptied and refilled like a tide after a squall. Mrs. Bellingham dabbed at the cloth as if neatness could reverse catastrophe. The doctor asked for air. Sergeant Webb, stout and bustling, took names and shooed gawkers, while the bell on the door trembled. Miss Marple stood quietly, hands folded on her handbag, watching the tremor settle upon certain faces. Hartnell looked appalled and secretly satisfied. Miss Pratt, the dressmaker, calculated what morning black might cost. By the umbrella stand, the new lodger, Rafe Ellison, tried not to see while seeing everything. On the long table, a place card strayed from its owner, and a cup bore a coral pink smear that did not belong to Mrs. Clement. Natural causes, the doctor murmured after his glance and shrug. He's had trouble with his heart. Sergeant Webb seized the verdict gratefully. Room stays as is. No washing up, ladies. Miss Marple bent as if for a spoon. and let her eyes rest on the cup Longman had used, then on the cup before the place card still reading MRS Clement. She said nothing beyond "Dear me," which in her case contained a small ledger of facts. When the ambulance had gone and talk flowed out to the pavement, Miss Marple walked with Mrs. Clement into sunlight that felt impertinent. "It seems impossible," Mrs. Clement whispered. "One speaks of the raffle and falls dead." "You moved to the window for Mrs. Hartnell's ear," Miss Marple said, as though continuing a recipe. "And Mr. Longman dislikes corners." The confusion was very human. Mrs. Clement shivered. "You saw everything." "One sees what people are accustomed to doing," Miss Marple replied. "They repeat themselves in emergencies." Pretty Mrs. Lethbridge, the new doctor's wife, hurried up. "My husband thinks the coroner will likely say heart failure," she confided. Still, Mr. Longman had opponents. "Parish business scratches. Nettles and blackberries," Miss Marple said mildly. "Both do." She went home by the churchyard, where the angel's stone wings were green with moss. Through a gap in the bluebell's curtain, she glimpsed Sergeant Webb frowning over the cups, the frown of a man who sees too many somethings and prefers fewer. Hopeful, that. Yet he would look for chemistry where character brewed. At the cottage, the kettle behaved, and the clock did not. Miss Marple made a very small list. Name cards moved, cup exchanged, coral lipstick, Rafe Ellison, draft by window. Longman dislikes corners. Under those she wrote, "Who knew Mrs. Clement's seat before the scramble?" The gate clicked. Cherry Baker from the tea rooms stood there, pink and penitent. "Oh, Miss Marple, I shouldn't bother you. Only Sergeant Webb says you're well sensible, and Mrs. Bellingham's in bits." I moved the jam. "The jam?" "Yes, ma'am. People grab strawberry and leave raspberry lonely, so I slid the dishes along the table." Then Mr. Longman swooped in, chairs scraped. Mrs. Hartnell said the window made her ear ache, and Mrs. Clement changed with her. "I never meant harm." "Most harm begins as tidiness," Miss Marple said. "Did you move cups?" "No, ma'am, only jam and 2 place cards to fill a gap. Mrs. Bellingham hates gaps," and I wiped a drip off one saucer with my sleeve before Mr. Longman sat. "Thank you. Tell Sergeant Webb exactly that, and do not embroider." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple considered sleeves, smears, and habits. Mrs. Clement wore beige lipstick. Coral suggested someone firmer. Mrs. Hartnell loved powder and pronouncement, not color. Miss Pratt liked a smart shade. The doctor's wife's prettiness ran to nervous pinks. The artist's hands were stained, but not with rouge. What remained was not poison yet, but intention. A cup placed for one and taken by another is either comedy or malice, and comedy had seldom chosen Mr. Longman. If someone meant Mrs. Clement to drink from that cup, the muddle served as cover, not cause. She rose, fetched her hat, and stepped into the lane with the look of an old lady going to remind a young one about oversleeves. She wanted another glance at the bluebells tables while cloths were unlaundered and lipstick unapologetic. But halfway to the green she met Mr. Badger, the ironmonger, pushing his bicycle like a reluctant confession. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," he said. "Mind you, Alfred pushed hard on the council new vendor contracts, rubbish collection, the allotments. Folks grumble when you tidy their shed. Tidying is a provocative art," Miss Marple agreed. "Tell me, had he quarreled lately?" "Oh, there's always something. Row with Mrs. Pratt about signage. He fined her for a dressmaker's board on the pavement, and he wanted the Women's Institute to move their storeroom. Ask Mrs. Bellingham." She near boiled. "Thank you, Mr. Badger. You are as ever illuminating." She watched him pedal away, then returned to the bluebell. Sergeant Webb looked hot and official, yet oddly relieved to see her. "Miss Marple, you were nearest the table. Anything you noticed?" "Only that muddles belong to people," she said, "and that someone wore a coral shade who does not usually wear it to tea. If you collect the napkins separately, you may learn who thought themselves neat." Webb blinked. Then, to his credit, began to bag the linen. Miss Marple, unhelpful as a kitten, drifted along the table and paused before the place card reading MRS Clement. Beneath it, a tiny smear of coral shone like an afterthought. She smiled a little, as if at an old memory, and let the smile fade before anyone saw. By morning, the whole of Mary Mead was speaking of little else. The Bluebell tea rooms stood closed behind its curtains, the notice, "Private until further notice," pasted to the door like a confession. Yet in the grocer's queue, on the church path, and in the vicarage kitchen, conversation brewed faster than any kettle. Miss Marple, however, had already finished her morning walk and was returning from the post office with a letter half hidden in her glove. She had written, as she often did, to her old friend Colonel Melchett at county headquarters, a simple inquiry about whether the late Mr. Alfred Longman had any history of quarrels involving official funds. At her gate she met Inspector Craddock, newly arrived from the county. He greeted her with a fond exasperation, as one acknowledges a relative who always appears where sense demands silence. "Miss Marple," he said, "you've saved me a journey. I suppose you were present yesterday." "Entirely by accident, Inspector, though accidents, like fruit, ripen when watched long enough." He sighed. "Dr. Henderson won't commit himself. He found traces of digitalis in the stomach contents, enough to make the heart fail, if given in tea. Digitalis is useful in small doses, deadly in larger ones," Miss Marple murmured. "It grows freely in the rectory garden, I believe." Craddock's glance was sharp. "You imply the vicar's wife might have collected it?" "I imply nothing, dear Inspector. I merely recall her fondness for gardening gloves. One learns to observe such things when darning stockings." They walked toward the tea rooms together. Mrs. Bellingham had opened the door for them, her eyes swollen and her apron stiff with starch and sorrow. "Such a respectable man," she said, "to go like that, and now they say it's poison, in my establishment." Craddock soothed her with formalities, and Miss Marple quietly inspected the scene. The table had been cleared, but she noted that the cloth, though washed, bore faint outlines where cups once stood. She measured the spacing by eye, then moved to the counter where cups and saucers now waited in a sterilized row. "Mrs. Bellingham," she asked, "did you recall who sat beside Mrs. Clement before everyone changed seats?" "Why, Mrs. Pratt, of course, the dressmaker. But she was called away to speak with Mr. Ellison, that painter fellow, about curtains for his studio. She never came back to her chair." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though she tucked the fact away neatly. Craddock began taking statements, while she observed Mrs. Bellingham's hands reddened from scrubbing but trembling slightly whenever the name Ellison was mentioned. There was something in that, some echo of indignation poorly masked. When they left, Craddock said, "So you think the poison was meant for Mrs. Clement?" "I think," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that the poison was meant for whoever habitually drank from that particular cup. People are creatures of routine. Mrs. Clement always sits by the window, and Mrs. Bellingham always places her cup with the gold handle facing right. Yesterday, both those habits altered." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "That's an awfully slender reed to rest on." "Perhaps. Yet reeds bend toward the truth if one is patient." They reached the vicarage by noon, where Mrs. Clement awaited them with tea she could not bring herself to pour. Her hands were steady, but her eyes betrayed sleeplessness. "Inspector, I can't bear to think it," she said. "Alfred Longman was a difficult man, but not wicked. Why would anyone wish me harm?" Miss Marple regarded her gently. "My dear, envy and resentment are domestic weeds. They grow without planting. Did you ever oppose him publicly?" Mrs. Clement hesitated. "There was the matter of the parish accounts. He wanted to divert funds from the church roof to the recreation ground. I refused to sign until the bishop approved. He called me obstinate before everyone." Craddock noted it grimly. "Enough to make enemies." Enemies seldom come from strangers, Miss Marple added. They grow, like foxglove, in familiar soil. When they departed, she asked softly, "Inspector, might I have a word with your constable about collecting the parish records? I believe the council minutes will show a pattern of objections names recurring in unpleasant ways." He agreed reluctantly, and she returned home beneath the hush of afternoon bells. On her porch waited Rafe Ellison, the painter-lodger, his coat speckled with ochre. "Miss Marple," he began, "forgive me, but Sergeant Webb said you were perceptive. You don't think they'll arrest Mrs. Clement, do you?" "I should hope not, Mr. Ellison. Do you?" He shifted uneasily. Well, Mr. Longman only last week said he'd ruin the charity fund if he could, but she's harmless, truly. The others, they talk too much." "Talk can indeed kill," Miss Marple said mildly. "Did you notice anything strange about the tea?" He frowned. "Only that Mrs. Pratt kept fussing over her lipstick. Said she'd lost the tube somewhere. Coral shade, I think." Miss Marple's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. "Ah, yes. Coral suits some complexions and damns others. Thank you, Mr. Ellison. You've been most helpful." He left, relieved but puzzled, while Miss Marple lingered by her gate. A lost lipstick, a changed seat, a quarrel over money, small things. Yet in her experience, murder always began with something small. She looked toward the church tower and murmured to herself, whoever placed that cup knew precisely who would drink from it, and who, if chance intervened, might die instead. That evening, Mary Mead settled into an uneasy quiet. Curtains were drawn earlier than usual, and behind the lace panels, speculation bloomed like mold. Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting untouched, listening to the faint tick of her mantel clock. She had long ago learned that time, properly watched, reveals what panic hides. At precisely 8:30, there came the expected knock-light, polite and faintly nervous. Mrs. Pratt stood on the doorstep, wrapped in a shawl far too fine for the chill, her eyes darting as though afraid of being seen. "My dear Miss Marple," she began breathlessly, "I simply had to talk to someone sensible. People are saying dreadful things about me." Miss Marple led her in with a small smile. "And why should they, my dear? Unless, of course, there is reason for them to do so." Mrs. Pratt's hand flew to her chest. "Oh, I assure you, I did nothing wrong. I only stepped out for a word with Mr. Ellison. And when I came back, there was all that screaming. It was chaos. And that horrid sergeant, Webb, kept asking whether I'd touched the tea tray. As if I would. You were seated beside Mrs. Clement, were you not?" "Yes. But she moved after Mrs. Hartnell complained about the draft. Honestly, one can't keep up with all these rearrangements. I never even drank my tea. I had the most frightful headache." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, once, twice, then stopped. "And your lipstick, dear, such a charming shade it quite stood out." Mrs. Pratt blinked. "My lipstick?" "Yes, coral, wasn't it? I thought I saw it on a cup that was not yours." The woman paled, the color draining faster than confession. "Oh, I mislaid it. You see, I think it must have rolled under the table. I didn't notice until after all that dreadful business. But surely that doesn't mean—" "Oh, Miss Marple, you can't think—" "I think nothing yet," Miss Marple said gently. "But lipstick, like truth, leaves its mark, whether one intends it or not. Tell me, when you spoke to Mr. Ellison, what was it about?" Mrs. Pratt's hands tightened on her shawl. "He wanted to know whether I could make curtains for his studio. He seemed terribly anxious about light and privacy. Said he'd had a break-in once. Such talk gave me shivers." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "Artists are sensitive creatures. They see things others prefer to overlook." Mrs. Pratt left soon after, her composure cracking only at the door. Miss Marple watched her hurry down the lane, then turned back to the small table where her notes lay. A misplaced lipstick, a convenient headache, a missing curtain order, and a man who liked to paint what others hid. The threads were gathering, though the pattern remained faint. By morning, Inspector Craddock was back in the village, with news from the coroner: death by digitalis poisoning, deliberately administered. The parish buzzed anew, and the whispering grew more cruel. Mrs. Clement withdrew from visitors entirely, while Mrs. Pratt began announcing to anyone who'd listen that her name would be cleared the moment the real villain is found. Miss Marple visited the vicarage under pretense of returning a borrowed book. The vicar himself met her, looking weary but grateful. "My wife's quite undone by it all," he said. "She keeps saying that if only she'd drunk first, Alfred might still be alive." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Guilt attaches itself to innocence, Reverend. It is a most determined parasite." In the drawing room, Mrs. Clement sat pale and composed, a teacup before her untouched. "They'll never believe I didn't mean it," she said quietly. "The poison was meant for me, wasn't it? That's what everyone whispers." "People whisper what entertains them," Miss Marple said. "But we must consider who knew you would sit where you did. Habit guided your choice until Mrs. Hartnell complained. And who, I wonder, guided hers?" Mrs. Clement looked startled. "Do you mean Mrs. Hartnell?" "Perhaps. She's fond of having opinions. But more likely she repeated someone else's." Before leaving, Miss Marple took a slow glance about the room. On the mantel stood a small silver frame, a photograph of the parish committee, taken 2 months prior. Mr. Longman, Mrs. Pratt, Mrs. Clement, and Mrs. Bellingham all smiled with brittle civility. Behind them, almost unnoticed, stood Rafe Ellison, half in shadow, his expression unreadable. That afternoon she walked to his cottage on the outskirts of the village. He was painting when she arrived, sleeves rolled up, eyes distant. "Ah, Miss Marple, come to see the chaos?" She studied the canvas, a half-finished scene of the tea-room, every detail exact save one. The chair where Mr. Longman had sat was empty. "A curious omission," she said lightly. "One might almost think you knew he wouldn't be there." He smiled faintly, setting down his brush. "You give me too much credit. I paint, and what I feel, not what I see." "Indeed. And what did you feel that day?" "Fear," he said after a pause. "But not mine." Miss Marple regarded him for a long moment. "Fear is seldom solitary, Mr. Ellison. It tends to keep company with guilt or with knowledge, sometimes both." She left him then, walking back toward the village as the evening bells began to toll. The air smelled faintly of foxglove from the rectory garden. Somewhere behind her, a curtain moved in an upstairs window, and Miss Marple, with that soft, inward sigh that always came before understanding, knew that the tea had not been meant for Mrs. Clement alone. It had been meant for anyone who might uncover a far older sin. The following morning brought a restless sort of brightness to Mary Mead. The sunlight seemed too sharp, the birdsong too brisk, as though nature herself had become suspicious. In the high street, the usual pleasantries were exchanged with a wariness that came from realizing one's neighbor might not be quite as innocent as imagined. Miss Marple, having spent the night in careful reflection, decided that no great harm ever came from a little visit timed just after breakfast, when defenses were low and tongues, aided by tea, often loosened themselves. Her first call was to Mrs. Hartnell, who had loudly claimed in the grocer's that she knew from the start that tea was never meant for poor Mr. Longman. The widow greeted her with exaggerated hospitality, ushering her into a parlor smelling of lavender and self-righteousness. "You must admit, Miss Marple," she began at once, "the whole affair proves what I've always said: modern morals are simply not what they were. Poisoning at a charity tea. Terrible indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly, taking her cup with both hands. "Though what puzzles me, dear, is how you happened to notice the draught just at the precise moment." Mrs. Clement rose from her seat. Most fortunate timing, really. Mrs. Hartnell's teacup rattled faintly on its saucer. Oh, well, I'm terribly sensitive to drafts, you know that. I suffered dreadfully from neuralgia, and Mrs. Pratt had left her seat, so I suggested Mrs. Clement take mine by the wall. It seemed the polite thing. Of course. Thoughtful as ever, Miss Marple said, her tone smooth, but her eyes unwavering. And you didn't happen to notice anyone at the table handle the cups when Mrs. Clement moved? Mrs. Hartnell frowned. No, no one. Except perhaps that young Ellison fellow he fetched more sugar. Always hovering about, if you ask me. Miss Marple nodded, thanked her hostess, and departed just as Mrs. Hartnell began to rehearse her own heroism for the third time. In truth, she'd expected the name. Suspicion was an easy currency in Mary Mead, and a stranger like Ellison made perfect change. But Miss Marple knew better than to follow the obvious. The Bluebell tea rooms were closed again, though a discreet knock brought Mrs. Bellingham to the door, her eyes red and her apron freshly pressed. "If it isn't Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling between gratitude and fear. "Inspector Craddock's been round again, asking after who handled the teapot. I told him the same as I told you, only me." "I'm sure you did, dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "and a very fine teapot it is, too." "May I see it?" Mrs. Bellingham hesitated, then produced it from the counter. Its silver surface gleamed dully in the filtered light. Miss Marple examined the spout, then the lid, and finally the handle, where faint smudges of rouge clung stubbornly in the grooves. "Lipstick," she said softly. The woman gasped. "I never, oh heavens, that must have been Mrs. Pratt." She was fussing with her face near the counter. "I remember now. Said she wanted to check the mirror." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And you poured from this same pot after she touched it?" Yes, of course. It's the only one we use for the table service." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her face a moment longer, then softened. "Thank you, my dear. I believe you've been most helpful." Outside, she met Inspector Craddock coming up the lane, his expression a mixture of irritation and grudging respect. "You're ahead of me again," he said. "We've confirmed the digitalis was mixed in the teapot itself. Clever work, the whole batch was poisoned. But only one cup had enough concentration to kill. I can't make sense of it." "Because," Miss Marple said quietly, "you're looking for a single act of addition when there were, in fact, two, one to place and one to stir." He stared at her. "You mean someone tampered with it afterward?" "Quite possibly," she replied. "And that someone may not have known precisely who would drink which cup. Murder often begins with intent and ends with opportunity's clumsy hand." Craddock frowned. "And your theory? That the killer meant only to frighten or silence a particular person, not to kill outright. But when the tea was disturbed, the dose changed hands. As they walked toward the green, the church bells tolled noon. Children's laughter floated from the lane beyond, oddly jarring in its innocence. Who would Mrs. Clement need silencing? Craddock asked finally. Miss Marple's voice was thoughtful. Perhaps not Mrs. Clement at all. Perhaps Mr. Longman knew too much. The question, Inspector, is what he knew and for how long he'd been holding it over someone's head. That night, Miss Marple sat again at her desk, knitting idle beside her. She unfolded the photograph from the vicarage mantel and studied the faces anew. Longman stood front and center, chest puffed, pride radiating from his very buttons. Behind him, half obscured by the edge of the frame, stood Mrs. Pratt, smiling too sweetly, eyes angled not toward the camera, but toward the man beside her, Rafe Ellison. Miss Marple's finger traced the faint outline of their proximity, and she thought of the missing lipstick, the painter's fear, and Mrs. Pratt's headache that came so very conveniently at the right time. Then, softly, she whispered, "Oh yes, love and pride make a deadly blend. And tea, dear Alfred, was only the beginning." The following day dawned overcast, as though the village itself wished to lower its voice. A thin mist hung over the hedgerows, softening the thatched roofs and making every window seem to watch. Miss Marple's curtains were already drawn aside, her breakfast neatly finished. She was not one to let weather or uncertainty delay her. She had spent much of the night reconstructing the pattern of tea, seats, and motives. And the pattern, though blurred, was beginning to sharpen. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock appeared again, his coat damp with drizzle and his patience wearing thin. "It's turning into a village circus," he muttered, accepting a cup of tea from her, as though it might contain both strength and sense. Every woman in Mary Mead's accusing the other. Mrs. Hartnell claims Mrs. Pratt meant to poison her out of jealousy for some church committee. Mrs. Pratt swears it was Mrs. Clement's doing, and the vicar's wife has locked herself away with her Bible. And the artist Ellison hasn't been seen since last night. Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Not seen? Left his cottage sometime after dark. His landlady says he mentioned going to London for supplies. No train tickets sold under his name, no luggage missing. Just gone." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Disappearing seldom solves anything. It only alters how one is found." Craddock sighed. "I'll have constables checking the roads. Meanwhile, we've confirmed something curious from the post office records. Mr. Longman sent a registered envelope 2 days before he died, addressed to his solicitor. It never arrived." Miss Marple set her cup down quietly. "Then someone intercepted it, likely before the tea." He nodded grimly. "We found traces of sealing wax in Ellison's grate. Red, same type used by the council. Could mean nothing, of course. Or everything," Miss Marple said softly. "Especially if Mr. Longman's quarrel involved parish money. Artists do like a patron. But Mr. Longman was a difficult man to flatter." Craddock stared at her for a long moment. "You think Ellison killed him?" "I think Ellison fears someone far more than he fears justice," she replied. "He saw something, perhaps even painted it. His picture of the bluebell, for instance. You recall, Inspector, that empty chair?" He frowned. "You said it was curious." "Yes, but not for artistic reasons. It was prophetic. That painting was begun before the tea, was it not? How could he have known which chair would be empty by day's end?" Craddock's brows drew together. "You mean he expected Longman's death? Or feared it?" Miss Marple said. "And in fear, people leave hints they cannot help but leave." She asked if she might see the cottage again. They walked there together, the lane slick with rain and the air full of distant church bells. Inside, the room was cold. The canvas still on its easel, the same unfinished painting glaring out. But now, Miss Marple noticed what she had missed before: a small smear of coral paint on the edge of the table, as though a hand had brushed it recently. She bent close. It was not paint. It was lipstick. "Mrs. Pratt has been here," she said. Craddock crouched beside her. "Are you sure?" "My dear Inspector, coral leaves few secrets, and Mrs. Pratt's vanity would not suffer a color less striking." They searched further, and under a pile of sketch papers lay a torn photograph, the same parish committee image from the vicarage. But here, Ellison had drawn faint pencil lines connecting Mr. Longman to Mrs. Pratt, and another between Mrs. Pratt and himself. Across Longman's face, one word: threat. Craddock swore under his breath. "Blackmail, then?" "Likely so," Miss Marple murmured. "Mrs. Pratt's charm is of the useful kind. She persuades, she distracts. And Mr. Longman, being self-important and fond of moral speeches, may have held something over her, perhaps a financial impropriety involving the council's funds, or a more personal indiscretion." "Then Ellison helped her?" Craddock asked. Miss Marple shook her head. "No, I think he protected her, foolishly. Perhaps lovingly. But the tea was her idea, not his. When Mr. Longman threatened to expose her, she tried to frighten him, just a small dose, she thought. But she was clumsy. The concentration was uneven. Mr. Longman took the cup that held the stronger portion. Craddock's expression hardened. And Ellison's disappearance. He discovered she'd gone too far. The painting, The photograph they show, he knew the truth. He may have tried to destroy evidence that tied her to the act. Craddock stood, jaw set. Then she'll be brought in. I'll issue the warrant at once. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Do, by all means, but tread gently. Vanity is fragile, and guilt hides best beneath fear of disgrace. She may yet confess if given the chance to believe she's pitied. As the inspector left, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer before the painting. Her fingers brushed the empty chair, then the shaded window beyond it. There was one more thread, she thought. One more detail that refused to settle. The dosage, yes, but who provided the poison? The foxglove grew in the vicarage garden, not Mrs. Pratt's. And as the door closed behind her, Miss Marple knew the case was not yet finished. Someone else had watched Mrs. Pratt's fear unfold and had quietly ensured that Mr. Longman drank death meant for another. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the village steeped in that peculiar silence which follows confession or catastrophe. Inspector Craddock had gone to fetch Mrs. Pratt from her home, and though Miss Marple did not doubt the woman's guilt, she doubted very much that guilt stopped there. The pattern, neat as it seemed, still had a thread hanging loose. She took her shawl and stepped out once more, the air cool and damp, the road glistening like polished stone. At the Bluebell Tea Rooms, the closed sign had been turned to "Open by appointment." Mrs. Bellingham was inside, wiping down the counter in a slow, distracted way, her movements mechanical, as though each stroke of the cloth erased not crumbs but memories. She started when Miss Marple entered. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm glad it's you. Such dreadful goings-on. Poor Mrs. Pratt taken away by the police like a criminal. I can hardly believe it, though, between us, I never did trust her laugh. Too high, too nervous." Miss Marple smiled faintly. High laughter often hides low intentions. "But tell me, my dear, did you happen to notice who fetched the tea leaves that day? Not the water or the cups, the leaves themselves." Mrs. Bellingham blinked, thinking, "Why, yes, I did. Now that you ask. I sent Cherry to fetch a new tin from the storeroom. The old one was nearly empty, and the guests were getting restless. Cherry Baker? The same. Poor girl's frightened out of her wits since all this began. She hasn't come back to work." Miss Marple's eyes warmed with understanding. "Then perhaps I ought to visit her. A little kindness is often more revealing than a great deal of questioning." Cherry Baker lived with her mother in a small cottage behind the greengrocer's. The door was half open when Miss Marple arrived, and she heard the murmur of voices, Mrs. Baker's anxious, Cherry's trembling. At the sight of the old lady, both fell silent. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said gently, stepping inside. "I came to see how you were faring, my dear. These are trying times, and I'm sure the police questions must have been most unpleasant." Cherry's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't mean to do anything wrong. I only fetched what Mrs. Bellingham told me. The tea tin was nearly empty, so I went to the storeroom and used the one on the top shelf, the one marked Darjeeling. It had dust on it, so I thought it must have been there ages. I just refilled the canister from it. That's all." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "The top shelf, you say? Not the one you usually use?" "No, ma'am. Mrs. Bellingham always keeps the daily tea in the middle shelf, but it was nearly finished. I thought I was helping." Mrs. Baker wrung her hands. "She's just a child, Miss Marple. You know she'd never harm a soul." Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on the woman's arm. "No harm at all, I'm certain. Only a mistake, but mistakes can be most illuminating. You see, Cherry, digitalis has a very distinct scent when dried and powdered, not unlike tea but sharper, the sort of thing an older nose might recognize." Cherry's lips parted. "Oh, but I didn't smell anything strange, only something bitter when I opened the tin. I thought it was stale." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Quite so." She rose to go, her expression kind but distant, her mind already arranging the facts like chess pieces. The wrong tin, a dusty top shelf, a substitution so simple a child could make it and so effective no one would suspect. Back at her cottage, she found Inspector Craddock waiting, his hat on the table and his mood grim. "We've got her confession," he said flatly. Mrs. Pratt admits to adding digitalis to the teapot, claims she only meant to make Longman ill, not kill him. But the dose, well, she underestimated her own ignorance. She says she got it from the vicarage garden. Miss Marple set down her gloves. How convenient, but not possible. He frowned. Not possible? She never handled the plant, Miss Marple said. Her hands are soft, unmarked. Digitalis leaves a rash, a fine red irritation on the skin. I saw her bare hands this morning. No trace of it. And she's not clever enough to grind the leaves without someone's help. Craddock's face darkened. Then who did? The same person who knew exactly where to find the poisoned leaves and who keeps the keys to the vicarage garden, Mrs. Clement. Craddock stared at her, appalled. The vicar's wife? Miss Marple's voice was very soft. A woman of deep faith and deeper pride. She loved her husband, but she also loved her reputation. When Mr. Longman threatened to expose the council's scandal, she stood to lose more than money, she stood to lose respect. And so, she placed the digitalis not in the pot, but in the spare tin, waiting for an accident to do what she could not bring herself to. Only the wrong cup went astray. Outside, the church bell began to toll the evening hour, and Miss Marple looked toward the steeple, rising pale against the mist. "Poison," she murmured, almost to herself, "is the weapon of the patient and the proud, and pride, Inspector, is the most dangerous poison of all." The following morning broke pale and chill. The sky drained of color. Mary Mead held its breath. The usual rhythm of clattering milk bottles and gossiping postmen was subdued, as though the village itself sensed that something final hovered near. Miss Marple rose early, her mind clear and sharp, her thoughts circling around Mrs. Clement like bees around an unopened flower. She had seen guilt before, disguised as charity, prayer, or propriety, and she knew its shape. It was neat. Too neat. By the time she reached the vicarage, Inspector Craddock was already there, pacing the gravel path with an expression that wavered between disbelief and grim acceptance. "I spoke to her, Miss Marple," he said, quietly. "She denies everything, of course, but she's pale as death, and the maid swears she found torn paper in the hearth last night. Could be the missing parish account book." "Could be," Miss Marple echoed softly, her gaze fixed on the vicarage windows. "Or could be something even more damaging. A letter from Mr. Longman." Craddock's brows furrowed. "If you're right, she's cleverer than I thought. Poison in the tea tin, that's patience, not impulse." "Patience, yes," Miss Marple murmured. "And desperation. The vicar's wife could never bring herself to strike openly. Her method would be subtle, her reasoning righteous. She would persuade herself that removing temptation or silencing scandal was almost an act of mercy." The vicar himself appeared at the doorway, his face haggard and drawn. "Inspector, Miss Marple, my wife is unwell. I beg you, if you must speak with her, be gentle. She's had a dreadful shock." Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost kind. "Of course, Reverend. We only wish to understand." Inside, the sitting room was heavy with the scent of flowers, white lilies, arranged too carefully. Clement sat upright in her chair, her Bible open on her lap, though her eyes did not rest upon the page. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her composure brittle. "Miss Marple." "Inspector, I suppose you've come to accuse me now. The village will be delighted." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The village delights in everything but truth, my dear. We came only to ask about your garden. You grow foxglove near the vicar's study, do you not?" Mrs. Clement's hands tightened. "Yes, for the color, that's all. I didn't touch it." "Of course not," Miss Marple said gently. But someone did. Perhaps someone who had seen you gather flowers before and knew where to look. There was a long silence. The ticking clock sounded very loud. Then, softly, Mrs. Clement said, "You think I meant to kill him?" Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "No, my dear. I think you meant to kill no one. You merely wished to stop him. You believed that by frightening Mr. Longman, you might spare your husband's name from scandal. You put the poison in the tea tin, certain that chance would handle the rest. But chance, as we know, has no conscience." Mrs. Clement's composure faltered. "He was going to ruin my husband, ruin the parish over a trifling mistake in the accounts. He was cruel, vindictive. I only wanted him ill enough to be silenced. I prayed it would be temporary." Craddock stepped forward, voice measured. "And Mrs. Pratt?" Mrs. Clement's eyes flickered. "I thought she might help me. She was terrified of Longman herself. I told her a little of my plan, enough to make her believe she could share the burden. I never thought she'd add more." Miss Marple's tone was soft, but there was iron beneath it. "You both underestimated poison, Mrs. Clement. It never obeys intentions, it obeys chemistry. A touch too much, a stir too long, and human life becomes mathematics." The woman covered her face with shaking hands. "God forgive me," she whispered. "I thought it was justice." The vicar entered then, hearing her words, and his face went white. He crossed to her without speaking, and for a long moment no one moved. The quiet filled the room until even the lilies seemed to hold their breath. Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "You were right, as usual. I'll take her statement." But Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, Inspector. Not yet. She will confess fully when the need to pray outweighs the need to hide. Let her reach that moment herself. It will come before sunset, I think." They stepped outside, the door closing softly behind them. The mist was lifting, and sunlight filtered weakly through the trees. "You've a remarkable calm about this, Miss Marple," Craddock said quietly. "Most would call it tragic." "Oh, it is tragic," she replied. "Tragic and ordinary. Pride, fear, and a little dust on an old tea tin, that's all it ever is. The sin may wear lace gloves, Inspector, but it always leaves fingerprints." As they walked down the path, the church bell began to toll for evening prayer. Miss Marple paused, looking back once toward the vicarage, where the curtains had just been drawn. "By tonight," she said softly, "Mary Mead will know everything, and by tomorrow it will have forgotten nothing." The evening light had deepened to amber by the time Miss Marple returned home. Her cottage, neat and unassuming, seemed to greet her with the same quiet composure she carried into every investigation. She removed her hat, set it upon the stand, and allowed herself a single sigh. Outside, the world appeared calm again, children calling across the green, the faint clatter of teacups from the vicarage kitchen, but beneath that calm, she sensed the invisible tension that always lingered when a moral balance had been disturbed and not yet restored. She set about preparing her tea, fresh leaves, properly measured, as though reclaiming that small act from the shadow of death that had tainted it. Yet even as she moved with habitual grace, her mind refused stillness. Something tugged, something faint, yet persistent. Mrs. Clement's tears had been genuine. Her guilt, though real, did not feel complete. There was a weight still unaccounted for, a missing piece that refused to settle neatly into place. At precisely 6:30, a knock sounded on the door, urgent, uneven. Miss Marple opened it to find Cherry Baker standing there, breathless, her apron still dusted with flour. "Oh, Miss Marple," she gasped. "They've arrested Mrs. Clement. Inspector Craddock came for her not half an hour ago. She didn't resist, just said she'd tell everything in due time. But something else, miss." She held out a folded scrap of paper, creased and smudged. Miss Marple took it delicately, smoothing it across the table. The handwriting was uneven but unmistakably male, thick, forceful strokes that betrayed a certain arrogance even in haste. You may think yourself clever, but remember, I know what was done to the funds. Try to play martyr, and I'll take the whole parish down with me." It was signed, simply, A.L. Miss Marple read it twice before speaking. "Where did you find this, my dear?" "In the storeroom, miss. It was wedged behind the old tins. I was cleaning like Mrs. Bellingham asked. It must have fallen from someone's bag." Miss Marple's eyes lifted, calm but intent. "Behind the tins, you say? Not in them?" Cherry shook her head. "No, miss. Just there, on the shelf." "Then it wasn't Mrs. Clement who lost it," Miss Marple said softly. "She would never have carried such a letter to the tea. It was someone else, someone who wanted to keep it hidden until it could be used." The girl looked puzzled. "Used for what, miss?" "For persuasion," Miss Marple said, folding the paper carefully. "The kind that turns pride into panic. Thank you, Cherry. You've been most helpful. And, my dear, don't breathe a word of this to anyone. The truth is, like tea, it must steep properly before it's ready to serve." When Cherry had gone, Miss Marple stood for a long time at her window, the letter between her fingers. She thought of Longman's self-importance, of Mrs. Clement's desperation, and of the quiet watchfulness of Mrs. Bellingham, the woman who had been at the center of it all, yet overlooked by everyone, including herself. Mrs. Bellingham, who had arranged the tables, who had handled every cup, who alone knew the sequence of serving, and who, perhaps, had known far too much about parish funds and the men who misused them. She took her shawl once more and walked into the fading evening. The lamps along the lane glowed faintly as she approached. The Bluebell tea rooms, where the windows were dark but the back door stood ajar. Inside, Mrs. Bellingham sat at a small table with her head in her hands, a candle flickering beside her. She looked up when Miss Marple entered, her eyes rimmed red but dry. "I suppose you know," she said quietly. Miss Marple inclined her head. "I know what you intended, but not quite why." Mrs. Bellingham gave a short, bitter laugh. "Why?" "Because he ruined me, Miss Marple. 10 years ago, before he was chairman, he borrowed money from my late husband's account, just a little, he said, to bridge the parish fund. Promised it would be returned. It never was. When my husband died, the debt was gone, but so was my savings. I kept silent because I had my reputation. Until Longman had the nerve to sit in this very room and sneer at me over my own tea. Her hands trembled. I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted him to taste what he'd made of me, bitterness. I meant to poison his cup alone, not the whole pot. But Mrs. Clement moved her seat, and then that foolish Mrs. Pratt stirred the tea again, thinking she was being helpful, and everything changed. Miss Marple's eyes were sad but steady. "You replaced the tin, didn't you? You saw Mrs. Clement's anxiety and realized you could hide your act behind hers. That was clever. Cruel, but clever." Mrs. Bellingham bowed her head. "She would have confessed to anything. A perfect shield. I told myself she deserved it for judging others so piously. But when I saw her taken away just now," she stopped, unable to continue. Miss Marple laid a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Guilt is a guest that does not leave when invited. You must tell Inspector Craddock everything before it grows too comfortable." Mrs. Bellingham nodded, her tears falling freely now. "I'll do it. I'll tell him tonight." As Miss Marple left the tea room, she paused on the threshold, watching the candle gutter in the window. The village was quiet again, too quiet, the kind that comes before a storm or a reckoning. She walked home slowly, the letter safe in her pocket, knowing that before the next dawn, Mary Mead would wake to the full truth, and that, as always, it would astonish no one. The night deepened as Miss Marple returned to her cottage. A wind had begun to rise, whispering through the hedges like gossip in the churchyard, and the sound of distant thunder rolled faintly over the fields. She lit her lamp, its golden circle of light falling upon the small table where the evidence lay, the folded letter, her notes, and a single sprig of dried foxglove from the vicarage garden. It was almost poetic, she thought, how human folly always found its expression in the most ordinary of things. Teacups, letters, flowers. She had seen it too many times to be surprised, but never enough to be indifferent. A soft knock broke her reverie. She opened the door to find Inspector Craddock looking weary and damp. He stepped in with the air of a man who had walked far and thought farther. "It's over, Miss Marple," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Mrs. Bellingham came to the station not an hour ago, confessed the whole thing, just as you predicted. Poison in the tin, guilt afterward, remorse now. I almost feel sorry for her." Miss Marple poured him tea, real tea, from a fresh tin and watched as he wrapped his hands around the cup. "You should feel sorry for her," she said gently. "She let bitterness eat her more slowly than the poison did poor Mr. Longman. When revenge pretends to be righteousness, the heart is always the first casualty." Craddock sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's tidy now, at least. The village will sleep easy tonight. Mrs. Clement will be cleared. Mrs. Pratt will preen, and the rest will return to their gossip. Mary Mead forgets quickly." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear Inspector, it forgets outwardly, not inwardly. The tongue heals faster than the conscience." He nodded, stirring his tea absently. "You know, there's one thing still nagging me. How on earth did you know? I had my eyes on Mrs. Clement, then Mrs. Pratt, even Ellison, but you went straight to the truth as though you'd already read the last page." She chuckled softly. "Oh, but life seldom hides its endings well. You see, Mrs. Bellingham betrayed herself the moment she tried to be too proper. Guilt is untidy. It stumbles over politeness. She couldn't bear to let anyone else pour the tea that day, and when she spoke of the teapot afterward, she called it my pot. Not the pot, but my. Possession is the truest confession, Inspector. People always give themselves away when they cling to what has damned them." Craddock smiled despite himself. "I'll remember that. You make it sound so simple." "It always is," Miss Marple said. "It's people who insist on complicating it. We tell ourselves stories to excuse what we already mean to do. Mrs. Bellingham told herself she sought justice. But in truth, she wanted to hurt someone who had hurt her. She planned it carefully. Yes, but she left morality to chance, and chance, as we saw, has a dreadful sense of humor." The thunder grumbled again, nearer now, and rain began to tap softly against the window. Miss Marple rose and drew the curtains, her movements unhurried. "You will find, Inspector," she said over her shoulder, "that murder never really leaves a village. It lingers in glances, in silences. People remember who poured the tea, even if they never say it aloud." Craddock finished his cup and stood, looking suddenly older. "Well, Miss Marple, I suppose this is one more for your quiet collection of small tragedies neatly solved. I can't thank you enough. You've been most patient," she said kindly. "That's rarer than cleverness." When he left, the door closed softly behind him, and the house fell once more into peaceful stillness. Miss Marple returned to her armchair and took up her knitting, though her thoughts drifted. Outside, the rain deepened, and the wind carried the faint chime of the church clock striking 9. She imagined the scene at the Bluebell tea rooms, the constable's lantern light flickering across the counters. Mrs. Bellingham weeping quietly as she signed her statement, the ghost of the day's laughter still clinging to the air, where scones and gossip had once filled it. The tea that was meant for someone else had found its victim, but the poison, the poison had long been in the village itself. Pride, envy, resentment, they brewed stronger than any Darjeeling. As she finished her row of knitting, Miss Marple's expression softened into something like sorrow. "Poor souls," she murmured, "so eager to forget that goodness, like wickedness, requires tending." She set the knitting aside and looked once toward the window, where the rain traced fragile paths down the glass. Tomorrow, the postman would bring fresh letters. The shops would reopen, and Mary Mead would resume its rhythm of small concerns and smaller confidences. Yet somewhere, perhaps in the echo of a teacup placed too firmly on its saucer, the memory of that fatal afternoon would linger, a quiet reminder that even in the most peaceful of villages, the human heart could steep its own ruin. Miss Marple blew out the lamp, and the room fell to shadows, save for the faint glimmer of lightning far beyond the hill. It flickered once, pale and fleeting, then vanished into darkness. The storm moved on, as storms always did, but in its wake the village slept uneasy, and Miss Marple, serene in her chair, thought only of morning and the way guilt, like tea, always tasted stronger the next day.